What's going on, guys? This is Rob. If you guys enjoy my content, make sure you hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit that little bell so you never miss out on my sexy voice. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and I wanted to talk about the Living Tribunal in Avengers 4. This is going to be one of those videos where I have a theory, but in the process of getting to the theory, I'm going to dump a ton of information on you guys. So you guys are going to walk away knowing a whole lot more about Marvel than you probably did before. Unless you guys have been reading Marvel for a long time, then you'll probably know about the same that you had before we started. But for the non-comic book reader, you're going to learn all kinds of crazy stuff. So first things first, what is the Living Tribunal and what purpose does it serve? Okay, the Living Tribunal is basically this judge of the multiverse. It's this being that exists out there in Marvel Comics, and there's only one of it. It might appear in multiple universes at the same time, but there's only one of it. All those different versions are just false, small facsimiles of itself. When it comes to the Tribunal, its job is to look at a universe and to say, okay, this universe cannot violate the mystical balance. It can't have too much power. It can't have more power than the other universes. It has to maintain the cosmic order of things. Now, what does that mean? Because that's a very ambiguous statement. So what does that mean? Okay, so back in the 1960s, really back in 1967, I think it was. I don't remember exactly the year that it came out, but it was Strange Tales 157 and 158. I'm pretty sure it was a two-part story that dealt with the villain Zom. Back then in the 1960s, when it came to the Doctor Strange comics, there were really no rules. Magic was a pretty new thing for Marvel Comics. For the most part, back then, like, Doctor Strange was about as powerful as you got. I mean, for the most part, like, you had things like Galactus, but the origin of Galactus himself and like the full might and power he actually possessed, that wasn't explained until 1969 with Thor issue number 169. So for the most part, even Galactus himself was ambiguous in terms of all the power that he had at his disposal. Now, in modern days, there's a far more organized and a much better ranking system in terms of how powerful different characters are. Marvel over the years has released something called files. They're basically one-shots, and it's a way to basically say like Thanos is a universal threat. If the Annihilation Nova Corps files are to be believed, that like, this character is this powerful, this character is that powerful, so on and so forth. They don't really rank them in relation to each other, but still, you have a far more organized system now than you did back then. But back in the 1960s, it was just kind of whatever. And Doctor Strange was just a guy who would like jump from dimension to dimension, and because he gained his spells from mysticism, there was really no limit to what he could do. Marvel could just have him do something and say, well, there's a spell, that's how he's able to do it. From there, it began to sort of get into the realm of like expanding into just wild and kooky things. And that's why if you go back and you read Strange Tales number 158, you see the first 138 rather, you see the first appearance of like eternity, the representation of the universe itself, of the actual space it occupies. There's stories where you see infinity, who's the representation of time, how much time passes between the time the universe first exists and the time it ends. You see entities like oblivion, which is the representation of the time between when the universe is destroyed and when a new universe is made. You see like all these different crazy entities out there. But for the Tribunal, because of the fact that it was originally a Doctor Strange character, it was really just kind of isolated to mysticism, simply saying, I exist to maintain the cosmic order when it comes to balance in the universe. Basically meaning there cannot be an imbalance of magical energies. And the reason why was because at the time, there was a villain called Zom. And Zom was just this crazy powerful guy, and he still is. I would say Dominic Toretto. I would say Zom is wildly more powerful than like Dormammu and Doctor Strange and the Ancient One. I mean, it took the Living Tribunal to stop Zom, if that gives you any indication of how powerful he is. It's insane. It's one of those things where like, if Zom full on invaded the main Marvel universe at full power, no one would be able to stop him. Like, it would, like, unless the Living Tribunal or somebody stepped in, no one would be able to defeat him. I mean, he's just that powerful. Inevitably somebody's going to ask, well, what about Zom versus the Infinity Gauntlet? No clue. Marvel never answers that question. So because of that, you get into like this really cool situation where the Living Tribunal is just there, and it's very regimented and very structured. The problem with this is that because of the fact that Stan Lee and Jack Kirby's line of storytelling in the 60s and 70s was really lighthearted, and it didn't really focus on like insanely godlike powerful characters, once they basically stepped down, and then you had other writers who began to step in, then you started seeing like insane levels of power in comics, powers that were so extreme that while they weren't based on like magic and mysticism, they rivaled the powers of Doctor Strange, and in a lot of instances actually exceeded his own power. This became even more of an issue when it turned into Doctor Strange, who was summoned by the Vishanti which is one of the people, like where a brunt of his spells come from. He was summoned by the Vishanti, and then he refused to fight on their behalf. They took his power away. They made a new Sorcerer Supreme, and then he got his powers back, but they were half of what they were. So he was basically weaker after that whole, primal god civil war, whatever it was. But the fact remains here, with the Tribunal, because he was based strictly in mysticism, as more and more powerful beings began to enter into the Marvel landscape from different writers, the question sort of began to take form. Well, what would the Living Tribunal do about them? Now, it wasn't like anybody sat down, right? At least as far as I'm aware, it wasn't like somebody sat down and said, okay, guys, we have these really powerful mutants and we have like some really powerful villains like Molecule Man. What's the Tribunal going to do here? It just sort of gravitated and just kind of turned into an answer to that question. Here's a really good example. In 1981, really before 1981, probably going back as far as the mid-1970s, Marvel was branching out of the United States. And Marvel was looking to start publishing comics in the United Kingdom. So they launched Marvel UK. And of course, they gave them their own Captain Britain, that kind of a thing. But in that line of stories, you saw a villain arise by the name of Mad Jim Jaspers. We talked about him before. I've got videos on him, but for the new folks, he is really powerful. Like, he was so powerful, they had to wipe out his universe. And the reason why was because of the fact that in Marvel Comics, it's a really obscure group. You never really hear about it. But in Marvel Comics, you have something called the Omni-Versal Development Court. And again, this was one of those different multiversal aspects that existed that kind of tried to answer the question of why the Living Tribunal doesn't step into like every situation when any being that's not magical has an insane amount of power. And so the Omni-Versal Development Court serves one purpose, and that's to monitor all the universes across the multiverse and make sure that their evolution all happens at around the same time. Basically meaning that like every universe has superheroes. Every universe has supervillains. Every universe has superpowered beings, and every universe has superpowered villains. The whole 9 yards. Like, it's designed to make sure all that stuff works. What had happened is in an alternate reality that had a numerical designation called Earth 238, that Jim Jaspers was a guy who had the ability to warp reality on a universal scale. But he didn't really want to like control the universe. He just wanted to be the only superhero, the only superpowered being on Earth. And so what he did is he created a being called the Fury. And the Fury had the power to adapt to everyone's powers. It didn't matter what those powers were. If they used it, the Fury could adapt to it and then overcome those powers and kill them. So think of the Fury as like the Sentinels from Days of Future Past, just not nearly as weak. And so because of that, what ended up happening is the Fury traveled across the planet Earth at the behest of Mad Jim Jaspers and killed off every single superhero that it found. And so the result was that in this universe, there were no superheroes. There was no superpowered beings except for Jim Jaspers. The Omni-Versal Development Court saw this and it didn't know what Jim Jaspers had done. All it knew was that Earth didn't have any superpower beings except for one. And so what they did is they initiated something called the push. They said, we're going to jumpstart the evolutionary process of humanity here, and we're going to start giving rise to beings with superpowers. Jim Jaspers realized what was going on and basically initiated something called the Jaspers Warp. And what this did is it started emanating all throughout the universe. Like, it was crazy. It started in a localized space, and it was like twisting buildings inside out, and like people were just being all twisted and mangled up. And it started emanating from the local region into like affecting the whole Earth, to affecting the whole solar system, moving on to the universe, and so on and so forth. And when the Omni-Versal Development Court realized what they'd done, they came to the real only logical conclusion that this Jasper's Warp is going to expand into the multiverse and like distort and warp the entire multiverse. And so they did the only thing they could do, which was destroy the entire universe of Jim Jaspers. Now, anybody who looks at that story will say, well, why wasn't the Living Tribunal involved? Because at the time, the Living Tribunal didn't really respond to non-magical threats because it just hadn't been written that way. It really wasn't in its charter. That didn't really happen on any real measure of a scale, I would say, until a couple of things took place. The first was a story involving Protege, and I can never remember for the life of me. I want to say it's the Guardians of the Galaxy 3000 story, and I can never remember when that came out. I want to say it was in like the late 80s or sometime during the 80s, maybe in the 90s. And then, of course, the Infinity Gauntlet story in 91. And what this did is it removed the Living Tribunal from strictly being a magical-based protector or judge or what have you. I think the Infinity Gauntlet is probably, I mean, it's obviously the most popular one that dealt with that, since I imagine a lot of you have never heard of Protege, who was a crazy powerful kid. Kind of getting into this for a second. Protege was a kid who was created to be the leader of the Universal Church of Truth in a different universe. And what was going on was that Protege had the power to duplicate the powers of anyone he saw with no upper limit. And eventually, like, he was copying the powers of like local people, and then he was copying the powers of cosmic entities, and then eventually copied the power of the Living Tribunal. Tribunal. And so the Living Tribunal judged against him. I'm sorry, maybe it was Skathan the judge, whichever one it was. One of the Celestials, Skathan the Approver, judged against Protege, and the Living Tribunal absorbed him, and then that was the end of him. But when it came to like Infinity Gauntlet, I would say that's really like the big landmark story where the Living Tribunal moved away from just being magic and dealing with various threats. And the idea at the time, and I'm sure a lot of people know about this, but for those of you guys who don't, the idea at the time, of course, with Thanos gaining the Infinity Gauntlet, the forces, really the good guys, essentially like went to the Living Tribunal alongside the cosmic entities and said, we need you to judge on this. Like, we have a guy here who's gaining absolute power. And the response of the Living Tribunal was, I judge in favor of Thanos, because he didn't make the Infinity Stones. So it's not like they're an artificial means to attain power. Like they're born as part of the universe. And so he's literally just harnessing in a part of the universe itself. He's not violating any laws here. He's not using magic, so he hasn't upset the mystical balance at all. And he's following the natural order of things in the sense that Thanos sought to replace eternity, the representation of the universe, instead of rule alongside of it. And so because of that, the Living Tribunal decreed the natural order of things is that the weak are removed to make way for the strong. That's just the way it is. That's the way it always will be. It's just the natural order of things. And so ultimately the Living Tribunal said, I judge in favor of Thanos, and bailed and left. And that was it. The Infinity Gauntlet event transpired. It reached its conclusion. Adam Warlock got the gauntlet, and then he was put on trial. And the Living Tribunal said, I judge against Adam Warlock. And the reason why was because Adam Warlock looked to rule alongside eternity as opposed to replacing eternity. And that upset the balance of things. It was a being with too much power that wouldn't have like a check and balance. There'd be nobody there in order for him to basically take their place, in the sense that because eternity is going to exist and because Adam Warlock's going to exist, you're basically going to have two of the exact cosmic entity in a universe, and that violates the natural order of things. And so the result was that Adam Warlock was forced to disperse the gems. They wouldn't work in unison anymore, and that was it. And so going forward into Marvel Comics, for the most part, that's just kind of what happened with the Tribunal. He started out as magic. He was eventually expanded, small little stories here and there. It was just writers invoking the Tribunal in their story to serve a particular purpose, and that was really about it. I mean, it was kind of a cool situation because when you sat down and you looked at the way things were in the 60s, sure, Doctor Strange being that powerful, Galactus being powerful, things like that, but the cosmic entities are part and parcel to the universe itself. For all the purpose they serve, they're like stars and planets and solar systems. They're just a part of the universe. So they need to be there. They have to exist. They don't upset the cosmic balance of things. But then somebody rising up with just an insane level of power, if, for example, like Franklin Richards sought to basically do exactly what Galactus does. Let's say, for example, that Galactus, with him traveling around the universe, consuming planets, so on and so forth. If Franklin Richards said, well, I'm going to do that exact same thing, the Living Tribunal would step in and say, nope, there can only be one person that plays the role of Galactus, and that's Galactus. Like, nobody else can do what he does. And so Franklin Richards will probably be like destroyed or forced to go back to the way that he was before or something along those lines. But again, it's just writers changing things up. That's the funny thing about comics. Nothing's ever an absolute. You can't take a level of power here and then a level of power there and compare them because they change all the time. And so with that in mind, like that's kind of where the Tribunal stands at the moment. That's the role that it basically serves. Now, getting into Avengers 4, in truth, it's a funny thing about the Living Tribunal, because the only real evidence people have for the possibility that it may or may not exist is from Doctor Strange when they reference the staff of the Living Tribunal. And it's cool when you get into that, because in Marvel Comics, the Living Tribunal has the solar staff. So it actually has that kind of a weapon in the comics itself, but we don't really know how that translates to the movies. In truth, it could just be that it's just called the staff of the Living Tribunal, because maybe in the Order of the Ancients, the group that Doctor Strange belongs to, that there is simply just like a group of people, like 3 people, who essentially just like governed that whole thing, and they're the Living Tribunal, and so that's why it's called the staff of the Living Tribunal. Or it could be the Living Tribunal actually exists in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. We know the multiverse is there, and the Ancient One established in the Doctor Strange movie that there are laws to each one particular universe governing magical energy, and it wouldn't really make any sense to have laws if there was no one there to enforce them. And so because of that, it makes sense that the Living Tribunal would actually exist. The question is, if the Living Tribunal showed up in Avengers 4, what could we expect? In all honesty, I wouldn't expect anything. I would expect the Living Tribunal to be there for like 5 minutes, and they would say, hey, like, how do you judge on this? And the Living Tribunal's like, I judge in favor of Thanos, the natural order of things, and then it would just leave. That would be it. Because it is a huge amount of power, but still, like, Thanos is doing what he believes to be the right thing, and it's using the very fundamental forces of the universe itself. They're not artificial creations, and so there would be no real violation there. But on the other hand, the Living Tribunal could say, well, Thanos is wiping out half the life in the universe, that's not okay. But it depends on how they want to adapt, like the comics to the movies and how far they want to go. The other half of this is that the reason why I don't really see the Living Tribunal acting is because if it did, then it would only ever really go one way. It would just end the Infinity Gauntlet. That would be it. It would just say, the gems don't work anymore. Done. And that would be the end of that. That movie would be 30 minutes long. It would be nothing more than that. Either that, or they would be bold in saying that, like, the Infinity Gauntlet rivals or is more powerful than the Living Tribunal, which, you know, I'd have a hard time getting on board with that. I wouldn't follow that belief. The Judge of the Multiverse is weaker than an Infinity Gauntlet. Like, that wouldn't really make any sense to me. But still, it is kind of cool when you get into that whole thing, because it could go any direction. I mean, the Infinity Gauntlet looks to be weaker in the movies than it is in the comics. I mean, half those fights in the movies would have lasted like that. They would have been over so fast because of how powerful the Gauntlet is. I mean, there's no glitz and glamour to it. You just say a thing or you think a thing and the Gauntlet does it. You know, it just makes it happen. And then again, of course, even Thanos himself is a little bit weaker, so maybe the Living Tribunal is weaker. I'm not sure if it even exists at all. But just kind of a theory, you know, just sort of throwing this out there, just kind of getting my thoughts out there in the realm of cosmic powers and so on and so forth. Let me know what you guys think, because I'm kind of curious. I know the Living Tribunal is one of these characters that's ambiguous to a lot of people, and they're curious about it, but they don't really know how it works. I'm sorry, one of the other things I want to mention here too is how the Living Tribunal judges. Just kind of a quick thing before we end this. The Living Tribunal has 3 faces, and whenever the Living Tribunal makes a judgment call, all 3 faces have to agree. If one of the 3 faces does not agree, then there's just further deliberation. They have to continue presenting their case until all 3 faces agree. So it's kind of cool in terms of how that works. But when the 3 faces do agree, then the judgment is handed down, and that's the way it is. So yeah, just kind of, I figured I'd throw that in there for those of you guys who are kind of curious. No one knows what the 4th face of the Living Tribunal is. Some say it's a stranger, some say it's, you know, a reflection of whoever's looking at it. You know, it gets kind of weird. But anyway, guys, we're gonna go ahead and bring this video to an end. And if you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.